So good evening. I'm John Garvey. I'm the president of the Catholic University of America, and I want to welcome you all to this opening for the Center for the Study of Statesmanship at the Catholic University of America. I want to begin by recognizing a few people who are with us here tonight, the Most Reverend Timothy Broglio and Claes Ryn. His Excellency is the Archbishop for the Archdiocese of the Military Services, and I was telling him as we walked in together that he probably has more foreign policy experience than anybody else in the room. He has served the Holy See in Ivory Coast, in Paraguay, in the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, and as also as the Chief of Cabinet for the Secretary of State for His Holiness Pope John Paul II. Professor Ryn is a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America and the founder of the Center for the Study of Statesmanship, and it's his intellectual vision and conviction that brings us here tonight. So thank you both for making this necessary, as Yogi Berra used to say. When Pope Leo XIII gave his blessing to the Catholic University of America in the 19th century, he said he hoped that, among other things, it would give the Republic her best citizens. And from the outset, part of our mission has been to prepare people for leadership of the nation and governance in accordance with our own moral convictions. This is why we built our campus in Washington, D.C., rather than in New York, say, or Philadelphia or Cincinnati, as somebody wanted to have it. Our faculty have given their attention, and still do, to the nation's most pressing needs, and we form our students in a Catholic intellectual tradition to become the next generation of virtuous leaders. One of the great overlaps between the social teaching of the Catholic Church and the framers' vision for America is an emphasis on the virtue of restraint. The Constitution, as you well know, puts checks and balances on the virtue as a way of decentralizing power. It also confers on the federal government only certain enumerated powers, and like Catholic social teaching about subsidiarity, it leaves other kinds of decisions to be made at a local level, and it puts hope in a virtuous citizenry to make these arrangements work. The Center for the Study of Statesmanship calls on this common interest of ours in restraint to examine our nation's disposition toward intervention in foreign affairs. It's an intellectually exciting and I think morally necessary proposition, and we're proud to have it at the Catholic University of America. We've prepared a short video for you about the center, about its mission and upcoming projects, and if things are working, I'd like to cue it up right now.
Great. I want to reiterate President Garvey's welcome. We're thrilled you all could make it. We had a surprise speaker, Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, and Paul Ryan surprised her by scheduling votes tonight, but she sends her best. And I'm just going to do some brief introductions. We're hoping to wrap up this program by 7:15 or so. Just like the food we serve tonight, this is meant to be an appetizer of the content we're going to provide, and hopefully we'll have some 7-course meals for everybody at a future date. To my immediate left is Doug Bandow. Doug is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a prolific writer on American foreign policy, appears on all the major networks. He was a special assistant to President Reagan, and to top it off, he has a Stanford law degree. To his left, His Excellency, the Archbishop Tim Broglio. Archbishop Broglio is Archbishop of the Archdiocese for the Military Services. So he actually has the largest archdiocese and diocese in the world because he provides spiritual and pastoral support for American military all around the world. And as President Garvey indicated, he is a seasoned diplomat in his own right. And if I did my research well, you were a diplomat at the time then Pope John Paul II was warning about the dangers of invading Iraq and what it would do to the Middle East. So I hope to ask you about that tonight. Finally, on the left, as President Garvey indicated, Professor Claes Ryn is been a professor at Catholic University since 1974 in political philosophy, but his ideas really were noticed by influential people, and that's why we have a center here today, because of his scholarship, which was at a very high level. He's taught at Catholic University as well as Georgetown and University of Virginia. He also lectured extensively in China, and in 2000 was invited to head up the Distinguished Foreign Scholar Lecture Series at Beijing University. and he is also an honorary professor at Beijing Normal University. He has numerous books on foreign policy, and I advise you to go to Amazon to look at some of them because they're very interesting. I want to start by talking to Doug first. And Doug, just lay out for you, particularly in the post-Cold War environment, there's been a sort of bipartisan consensus on what we should do in foreign policy, how we should approach it. Talk about what that's wrought from a policy perspective.
Well, the Cold War essentially forced a certain degree of humility. You faced a superpower, you faced a power with nuclear weapons, that any conflict that got out of hand could go nuclear, could be extraordinarily expensive. The end of the Cold War gave, a lot of the expressions, America was the unipower, the hyperpower, the country that could kind of set the agenda. I mean, even with that context, I think of the transition. I came to Washington with Ronald Reagan. I mean, he had any number of flaws that one can talk about. Nevertheless, I think on an issue like this is a man who, number one, hated war. I mean, the left never got that, but he was horrified by the idea of nuclear war. That's what caused him to be in favor of the idea of some kind of a missile defense. The second was that he could see there are differences in the Soviet Union when he recognized that Gorbachev was different. And over the kind of opposition of some of his very conservative advisors, he said, this is a man we can make peace with. And to me, that was extraordinarily important. You had two men at the right time who, in fact, could bring to an end this horrendous Cold War that we had and open up the opportunity for freedom to spread so dramatically. He was also somebody who I think could understand that end the Cold War, that it's gone, and then there's something else. That he didn't see this as kind of a continuing conflict, something where America would have to pick up yet a new role. I have trouble imagining him in certain ways glorying about fire and fury and kind of going mano a mano with the pipsqueak third-rate dictator of a small country. This is not, it strikes me. So I think of statesmanship, I do think of Ronald Reagan. That this is a man who really did manage a transition extraordinarily well, that was critically important. And we're into a completely different world today. And what we find, it's perpetual war now. And I think to me that's the extraordinary thing. For Reagan, Reagan used force 3 times, reluctantly, temporarily, and he was done. He recognized that Lebanon was a mistake. You read his memoirs. He got the fact that didn't work well. But today, it never ends. And to me, that is a transfer. And the cost is extraordinary. Cost of lives, of money. Andy Bacevich mentioned the instability abroad, but not just us, it's other people, which almost always gets missed from the American debate. I mean, Iraq has been wrecked. Hundreds of thousands of dead, destruction of the Christian community. Many of those people fled, of all places, to Syria, where people wonder why do people support Assad? Well, Christians there saw the movie, didn't like the ending in Iraq. Crazy people take control, Christians and minorities get killed. So this is where we desperately need this humility, this reluctance.
Let me ask you to prognosticate a little bit about the Trump foreign policy, because it has this kind of schizophrenic quality about it. He was anti-interventionist during the campaign, but now he wants to send more troops to Afghanistan. We need to be friends with Russia. Russia's now an enemy. There's a little, we shouldn't overthrow Assad, but he bombed Assad. Where do you think this is going? Is this returning to what is the consensus since the end of the Cold War of the establishment, or is this going in a different direction?
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. One of which is he has no fixed ideology. So that he has gut reactions, which often, not always, often are pretty sensible. What are we doing in Afghanistan after 16 years? I don't know. He doesn't quite get it. And he had many times he expressed that. Syria, why on earth do we want to engage in regime change yet again, given our experience? Russia, it makes sense to have a better relationship. So one of the problems, though, I think, number one, is the fact he doesn't have a fixed ideology. So then there's that kind of emotional impulse and all of a sudden of, oh, we must do something, we must look tough. When in North Korea, he said everything from Kim Jong-un is a smart cookie who I'd be honored to meet, to I'm going to send the armada off the coast and we're prepared to nuke them. I mean, you can't get much broader than that reaction. And the second is he surrounded himself with people who, for the most part, are pretty hawkish. And they range. I think that General Mattis is a very sensible, grounded fellow. On the other hand, I think he's very conventional in his thinking. Nikki Haley, I think, is essentially a neoconservative who'd be happy to start nuking people. So if you surround yourself with those people and you kind of let them drive the foreign policy, that's what we see on Afghanistan and everything else.
Your Excellency, I want to ask, there's a lot of practical policy, complicated policy issues involved here, but I want to ask you a little about the human cost. Particularly, let's first turn to Christians in the Middle East. I know you know a good deal about this. We can talk day and night about geostrategy, but what happens to the human beings are really the result of policy. What happened to the Christian community in the Middle East after all these American interventions?
Well, just returning to the notion of St. John Paul II, who was very, very against the invasion of Iraq, because he said, you know, we know how war starts, we don't know how it finishes. And certainly in terms of the Christian population in Iraq, it's probably good to remember that with the exception of Lebanon, of the countries in the Middle East and in North Africa, the best place for Christians in the Middle East, not that it was good or optimum, but the best place was Iraq. So there were some 1.4 million Christians in Iraq at the time in 2003. There are now, well, probably the most radical estimates are about 275,000. So that is a tremendous decrease in the Christian population. And they feel pushed out of places where they have lived for centuries, even from almost biblical times. And so that's a tremendous cost for the Christian community as they move again. And as you said, many of them moved to Syria. Many of them also came to Europe and to the United States as well, because generally the Christians have family that are in other places, and so it is possible to move and to resettle. But it's still obviously very traumatic to leave your homeland behind. And that's certainly a result of the chaos that was the result of the war in Iraq.
What about another community heavily impacted by this, and you're probably more aware of the strains and pressures on them than anybody, and that's American service members and their family. The pace of operations, the number of deployments, the length of deployments, this has got to be an incredible strain that you and your chaplains see firsthand. Talk a little bit about that cost.
The human cost is incredible. If you think about the fact that we've basically been at war for the last 16 years, and the community that pays the price for that are those who fight the wars and also their families. So you have the separation caused by deployment and by repeated deployments. You also have a situation that when the family member comes home, everyone has to readjust, because obviously the children have assumed responsibilities that wouldn't normally be theirs. The wife or the husband have assumed responsibilities as well that aren't theirs, and then this figure returns and everything has to be readjusted, and that creates also tension and creates friction in the family. So and then just the notion of, you know, will I have to return? Is this whole thing going to repeat itself? And of course, many times it has repeated itself. And so that's a tremendous human cost. I'm frequently amused because people seem to think that the military is hawkish, but actually I think I work with the community that's most interested in peace, because they're the ones that pay the price when war is the reality.
Claes, let me turn to you. There seems to be a consistent pattern, really since the end of the Cold War, on a bipartisan basis. There are a lot of mistakes getting made, and a lot of the mistakes turn out to be the same mistakes. So it seems like this is not just an error in practical judgment happening here. There's some underlying philosophical issue impacting really the foreign policy establishment that really pushes the culture in that direction. Talk a little bit about what you think that might be. It's an issue we want to explore in the center. So take us upstream, as you said in the video.
When I think about these issues, I think of the framers of the U.S. Constitution as providing a kind of lodestar. They're a central frame of reference. And I think about their view of human nature and politics. They understand that human beings are sometimes cruel, ruthless, greedy, and I could pile on a number of bad things that are characteristic of human beings, but they also believed that there is a different side to human beings. They can rise toward a, shall we call it a higher self. Now, the reason they thought of politics the way they did was that in a part of themselves, they were afraid of human nature. The sinfulness of human nature had disastrous consequences, and this is why constitutionalism came naturally to them. Human beings need to be restrained. They need to be guided by law. They need to be guided by parents, by church, by community. They need to be guided by a constitution. They need to be restrained by a constitution. Now, the constitution that they wrote put a very heavy emphasis on the need to restrain power, to restrain human beings, because you can't trust them with too much power. So you need to check power, you need to divide it, you need to decentralize it, and they put a premium in this Constitution on the need to compromise, to work out your differences, to deliberate. America was to be governed not by the passion of the moment, by the majority plus one. America was going to be governed by something like the deliberate sense of the people. So you were supposed to step back from the passions of the moment. Deliberate when you are cool, when your passions are not agitating you. This was their ethos, and I think that's the kind of an ethos that we at the center feel very much at home with. Now, what has happened is that over the years, ever so slowly, and in recent decades, increasingly, a very different view of politics and human beings has become influential. It is common now for Americans in leadership positions to think of themselves, have you heard this phrase, as exceptional. America is an exceptional country. That is to say, it's as if Americans were exempt from original sin, greed, ruthlessness, carelessness, recklessness, short-sightedness, all of these things. And how are they able to persuade themselves that they have some sort of mission, that they have stepped outside of the human condition? Well, ideologies, some of them with a clearly utopian emphasis, have become influential. And so what we have seen increasingly, and I'm not going to identify particular presidents or particular parties as representing this, we have the idea that the United States is called, as an exceptional nation, to remake the world for the benefit of the world. America is to be the spearhead of democracy and freedom, and these are beautiful things. America does not need to be restrained. It's a virtuous nation. And as a virtuous nation, it's on the side of good, and we're going to defeat the bad guys. And is there any reason why the good guys should be restrained the way the framers of the U.S. Constitution had in mind? Have we as Americans stepped outside of the limitations of human nature? Well, that is the sort of assumption that is working beneath these foreign policy initiatives. That is the idea that America is exceptionally called to remake the world. As an incidental benefit, that means that America will become more powerful than any country previously on earth. Now, just a side comment here, it used to be that people in the West, including the framers of the U.S. Constitution, considered pride to be the cardinal sin. They were always interested in humility and moderation. This is the tradition that we are leaving to the side.
How can the center address these issues? Put it simply.
This is a long-term project. And I think I would argue that you could summarize what we are about as it relates to international relations, but also as it relates to interest groups getting along with each other, is cosmopolitanism. When you do a serious study of the great civilizations of the world, you discover that there is an enormous amount of overlap between these civilizations as to what is regarded as admirable human traits. Courtesy, courage, moderation. I could go on and list traits that are respected by Confucians and Aristotelians, Christians and Buddhists. Now, having said that, is to define a problem. People are not born courteous, moderate, humble. They need to be educated toward those kind of character traits. Parents, church, community, tradition needs to buttress people, to keep them on the straight and narrow. So if you think, as I do and as the center does, that a kind of cosmopolitanism should be cultivated as a way of creating respectful relations among nations, among peoples, among individuals, groups, then you have a lot of work to do, because people have to be educated. They have to be formed toward these character traits. And this is where the Catholic tradition, not least, but the entire Western tradition comes into play. That is, we need to explore the sources of sound statesmanship. That means, to a very great extent, focusing on how can the right kind of human being be produced. When the going gets rough in foreign policy, when the passions run high, what's going to avert war? In the end, I think the only people who can step back from the passion of the moment are people who have this kind of character, to step above the passions of the moment and cool their heads and recognize that human beings are on the other side. We need to look at whatever it is that has them upset. Let's work this out. Unfortunately, that sort of an attitude does not come naturally to human beings. That's not what we're like. We want to have it our way. And if we have a lot of power, we love to lord it over others. That's something that we have to be taught not to do. We have to call ourselves back.
Well, that's our appetizer. I'm going to give the opportunity for the panel to mingle with the guests who kindly showed up tonight, and I thank you again for coming. All set? Yeah, thank you.